Hi everybody. This session we are discussing on a new topic, that is ocular drug delivery system. So in this chapter you will be learning about what are the anatomy of eye, what are the barriers for delivery system, and how to develop an ocular drug delivery systems. This session we are discussing on the anatomy of eye. So here is the ocular anatomy key components. Dear all, the anatomy of eye is something different, something difficult, but it is, you can learn it. If you understand the concept, you can easily catch up the things. Let us discuss first the ocular anatomy. The eye, if you consider, it has divided into two segments, that is the anterior and the posterior segment. What we are seeing, if you look into the eye, what we are seeing from the outer portion, from the outer part of the eye, what we are looking into, this portion is considered as the anterior segment. We all know, we all studied in our lower classes that eye is like a ball with a specific orbit. So eyeball, the from what we are seeing into the eye, what we can see, that portion we call it as the anterior segment. Just backside of that portion, that we call it as the posterior segment. The anterior segment again has been classified as anterior chamber and posterior chamber within the anterior segment itself. The anterior chamber consists of the various parts like conjunctiva, sclera, cornea, pupil, corneoscleral limbus. And the posterior chamber consists of trabecular meshwork, Schemmann's canal, anterior chamber angle, ciliary body, iris, lens, and choroid. Whereas the posterior segment consists only of retina. So this portion, entire portion, we can see from the outside, whereas the posterior segment, it's not possible to see from the outside with our human eyes. Now let us look in depth into one by one. The front section, the anterior segment, extends from inside of the cornea to the surface of the lens, that is the anterior segment. The back section extends from back surface of the lens to the retina. It contains a jelly-like fluid called, that is the vitreous humor. So if you can look into this picture here, it is clearly mentioned the anterior segment and the posterior segments. So from the front of the eye to the lens, up to the lens portion, that is the anterior segment. So up to this point we can call it as the anterior segment. Behind the lens we can consider as the posterior segment. Yes, let us continue. First let us discuss about the anterior segment. It is filled with a fluid called aqueous humor, which nourishes the internal structure. The anterior segment is divided again as anterior chamber and the posterior chamber. The anterior chamber extends from cornea to the iris. So again, if you look into the same picture, here they have mentioned anterior chamber and the posterior chamber. Anterior chamber is the portion from the cornea up to the front of iris. So this portion, this blue colored extended portion, is the iris. So here is the iris. So from the front of this eyeball, that is the cornea, from the cornea to the front of the iris, that is called as the anterior chamber, and the back of the iris up to the lens portion is called as the posterior chamber. So anterior chamber and posterior chamber, each part has its own, like each segment has its own separate parts. Normally the aqueous humor is produced in the posterior chamber. In the anterior segment itself, the aqueous humor is produced in the posterior chamber, flows through the pupil into the anterior chamber, then drains out of the eyeball through outflow channels located where the iris meets the cornea, that is called as the Schemmann's canal. Okay, I will explain again this with a picture. Now, the aqueous humor is produced in the posterior chamber. So posterior chamber is the back portion of your iris. So here you can see this is the area where we get the secretion of your aqueous humor. The aqueous humor, what produced in this posterior chamber, is flows into the entire segment. Into the anterior chamber it moves, that is it comes to the back side of the iris, it enters into the pupil. This, the gap between the two irises is considered as the pupil. So it enters the pupil into the anterior chamber. So here it is the anterior chamber. So the aqueous humor produced in the posterior chamber flow backside of the iris, enters into the pupil, and it enters into the anterior chamber. From the anterior chamber it flows out to the through the Schemmann's canal. So here this portion is called as the Schemmann's canal. From there it enters into the blood circulation. So this is the pathway of the aqueous humor. Next is the light enters through the cornea. So we said some parts of your anterior segment. So these parts we'll discuss one by one here now. The light enters through the cornea, the clear curved layer in front of the iris and the pupil. So this we are discussing about the cornea. Cornea is a clear, transparent, curved layer front of the iris and the pupil, and the cornea serves as a protective covering for the front of the eye and also helps focus light on the retina at the back of the eye. So this portion we call it as what? This portion we call it as the cornea. Cornea situates in the front of the lens, oval shape. It helps in focusing of the light through the lens exactly on the retina at this portion. The outer covering of the eyeball consists of a relatively tough white layer called sclera or white of the eye. Near the front of the eye, in the area protected by the eyelid, the sclera is covered with a thin transparent membrane, that is the conjunctiva, which runs to the edge of the cornea, and the conjunctiva also covers the moist back surface of the eyelids and the eyeballs. So sclera forms the white color portion of the eye, and in a transparent membrane, that is we call it as the conjunctiva. Now, after passing the light to the cornea, it travels into the pupil, and next is the limbus, is the where the cornea meets the sclera. So as we all know, the pupil, where the pupil exactly locates. So the pupil, that's a gap between the two irises through which the light exactly passes. At the bottom of the iris, that we call it as the limbus area, and also there we have the corneoscleral limbus, where the cornea and the limbus comes in contact. That portion we call it as the corneoscleral limbus. Now the iris, the circular colored area of the eye, surrounds the pupil, controls the amount of light that enters the eye. The iris allows more light into the eye when the environment is dark and allows less light into the eye when the environment is bright. So, iris is the projected portion which is situated in the pupillar area, and which controls the amount of light enters into the eye by changing its shape by elongation as well as by shrinking process. So based upon the light availability, there will be shrinking and elongation of or enlarging of the iris. Behind the iris sit the lens. By changing its shape, the lens focuses the light into the retina. So that's the main part of our anterior segment. Now the posterior segment, as I already said, extends from back surface of the lens to the retina. It contains a jelly-like fluid called vitreous humor. Now, so this classification as an anterior and a posterior segment, and again as an anterior chamber and a posterior chamber, is based upon our vision from the front of the eye. But if you look into the structure of the eye is like a ball. It's again a ball round shape structure. So in this structure, again it can classify it as an outer layer, a middle layer, and an inner layer. The outer layer, which contains the sclera, the cornea, and the conjunctiva, whereas the middle layer contains the choroid, iris, and the ciliary body, and the inner layer contains the retina. So as we consider as a ball, as the anatomy of this ball, eyeball, it consists of outer, middle, and inner layer, whereas the purpose, the role of each layer is specified and discussed above. Now the outer layer, cornea, this we have already seen. Some characteristics of cornea includes avascular, it is transparent, it provides most of the eyes its optical power, and the primary function is to refract the light. This is the cross section of a cornea. So the cornea contains an epithelium, a Bowman's membrane, a collagen fiber, a descendant membrane, an endothelium, and finally a stroma. So this is the structure of the cross section of our cornea. Let us see one by one. Epithelium is the outer layer about 5 cell layers thick, act as a barrier and can be regenerated. So that is the main characteristics of the epithelium. It is the outermost layer of the cornea, and it is a barrier. At the same time, if there is some damage also, it can regenerate. The inner layer of the epithelium is the Bowman's layer. That's a very thin membrane. Again consists of the stroma made of collagen and accounts of 90% of the thickness of our cornea. Descendant's membrane consists of collagen and elastin. And finally, the endothelium is a single cell layer that cannot regenerate but maintains the hydration. So these are the layers of the cornea. The outer layer consists of sclera. We said is the white of the eye. It is made of tough fiber layer that maintains the shape. So you can see the sclera is a tough layer. As I said, in the next session we will be discussing on the barriers to the delivery of eye, barriers for drug delivery into the eye. So that time this cornea, sclera, etc. can act as the major barriers. The sclera covers 80% of the eye and it's visible as white of the eye. Conjunctiva is the transparent membrane over the sclera and on inside of the lids. It is thin, transparent, loose membrane and it merges at limbus with a corneal epithelium. So here you can see the upper peripheral conjunctiva and a lower peripheral conjunctiva, and it merges as a portion of the limbus. Again, the middle layer which contains many blood vessels, that is the main part is the choroid. Choroid contains various blood vessels and supply oxygen and nutrients to the retina. The middle layer again consists of iris that regulates the light, ciliary body controlling and focusing the light, and the ciliary processes that secretes the aqueous humor. So this is all about general anatomy of the eye in concern with the drug delivery or the drug development. If you can focus much into the anatomy, anatomy is again a much vast part where the muscles and the inner portion of the eye, the inner layer like retina, these are the areas which we didn't discuss much. But considering the delivery of drug into the eye, these are some of the main anatomical parts which we need to discuss. So that's all for today. Thank you.